Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. Today, we're going to be talking about the conflict in Ukraine. And, it's a sensitive topic for sure. It sparks a lot of, really strong emotions and opinions. But we're here to try to take a step back, from those kind of, surface level hot takes and really do a deep dive into some alternative perspectives.
Yeah. And it's interesting, because we're constantly being bombarded with information, especially about this conflict. And, as you said, there are a lot of very strong opinions and narratives already formed around it.
Exactly. And, what we're going to be doing today is looking at two sources that kind of offer some different lenses through which to view this whole conflict.
Yeah, that's right.
So the first one that we're going to be looking at is an interview with Professor Ivo Budil. And he's an anthropologist who spoke on Radio Universum.
Okay.
And he kind of brings in this like historical and geopolitical lens to the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then the second source we're going to be looking at is an opinion piece by Yan Angelgard. And that's from a Polish publication called My Polska.
Okay.
And he really digs into this idea of the influence of certain narratives on Polish foreign policy.
Interesting.
And he specifically references the ideas of this guy, Jerzy Giedroyc. Have you ever heard of him?
I have heard the name, but to be honest, I'm not super familiar with his work.
Okay, we're going to dive into that a little bit later, I think.
Yeah, sounds good.
So, one of the things that we hear a lot about is, this idea of Russia being inherently expansionist, especially with all the focus on Putin, right?
Right.
But Professor Budil kind of challenges that notion, like that oversimplification, I guess you could say.
Yeah, and I think that's really important because, we often tend to fall into these very simplistic narratives, good guys versus bad guys.
Yeah.
And the reality is always much more complex.
Totally.
Yeah.
And so he argues that Russia's expansion, throughout history, like that of other empires, has always been driven by a lot more than just grabbing land.
Yeah, it's always complex interplay of factors, isn't it?
Totally.
Yeah.
You've got security concerns.
Yeah.
You've got geopolitical pressures. You've got all sorts of, historical baggage that goes into these decisions.
Yeah, it's never as simple as, just this kind of like, land hungry, monster.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. And so, Budil even argues that Russia's current strategic focus is actually on Eurasia.
Interesting.
Not on like expanding into Central Europe.
So he doesn't see them as like an immediate threat to, like Poland or anything like that.
Well, yeah, I mean, he doesn't really address that specifically, but he does say that he thinks that they lack the capacity and maybe even the desire for like a large scale, advance into Europe.
Okay, that's an interesting take.
Yeah.
And this is where Engelgard's piece kind of comes in, right?
Right.
Because he directly challenges this fear that, you see a lot in Poland that Ukraine's loss would inevitably lead to Poland's downfall.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, Poland has been so supportive of Ukraine.
Yeah, they've really been on the front lines of that support, haven't they?
Right.
Yeah, and Engelgard is actually quite critical of that.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he sees it as kind of, almost like a blind support. And he argues that it could actually endanger Polish independence.
Wow. Okay, that's a pretty provocative argument.
It is, yeah. And, it kind of makes you think, about the different motivations and the different perspectives that are at play here.
Yeah, it's not always as black and white as, we might initially think.
Right, exactly.
And, going back to Professor Budil, he also touches upon this idea of the psychological impact of the 1968 Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia.
Oh, yeah.
And how that kind of historical trauma, continues to fuel a lot of the anti-Russian sentiment, especially in the Czech Republic.
It makes sense, right? I mean, that was a really traumatic event.
Yeah, absolutely.
A lot of people, still carry those scars.
For sure. And I think it's important to acknowledge, how those past experiences shape how we see the world today.
Absolutely, yeah. And, Budil actually draws a parallel with other historical examples of, scapegoating and this idea of othering.
Right.
He's concerned about the dehumanization of Russians in some narratives. And it's interesting because the responses from the Radio Universum listeners to his interview really highlighted this, spectrum of opinions.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Like some people were like, I totally agree with them. We can't just demonize an entire nation.
Right.
But then there were others who were like, no Russians are the enemy. And, we need to treat them as such.
It's fascinating how these different perspectives really come out. When you have a discussion like this.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it shows you how these historical memories and personal experiences really color our understanding of what's happening in the present.
Yeah. And that actually ties into Engelgard's analysis, too.
Okay, how so?
Well, he talks about how, fear and these historical narratives, they can be used to justify specific policies, and potentially blind people to alternative perspective.
Right. Yeah. And to the risks of those policies, too.
Exactly.
It's like wearing blinders,
Yeah.
You only see what's right in front of you, and you miss the bigger picture.
And I think that's what both Budil and Engelgard are really trying to get us to see.
Totally.
To step back and look at the bigger picture.
Yeah. And, Engelgard sees this happening in Poland, where this fear of Russian aggression is kind of being used to justify this unwavering support for Ukraine.
Right.
Even if it might not be in Poland's long-term best interest.
It's a complex situation for sure.
It is, yeah. And to understand this, we kind of need to bring in this guy, Jerzy Giedroyc.
Okay, so who was he again?
So he was a really prominent Polish intellectual, and he really heavily influenced Polish thought, on Eastern Europe.
Okay.
And what Engelgard argues is that while Giedroyc did champion Ukrainian and Lithuanian independence,
right,
he also emphasized the importance of normalized relations with Russia.
So he didn't see it as a zero-sum game.
Not at all.
Interesting.
And he also cautioned against blind allegiance to the West. He believed that Poland should kind of maintain its own, strategic autonomy.
So kind of threading the needle between these different, power blocks.
Yeah, exactly.
That's a delicate balance.
It is. Yeah. And so, Engelgard sees that kind of balanced approach as missing in current Polish foreign policy.
That's interesting.
And, this kind of brings us to this bigger point about the danger of, simplistic narratives in international relations.
Oh, for sure.
Like, it's so tempting to fall into that good guys versus bad guys trap.
Yeah, it's easy to oversimplify things.
Totally, yeah.
And, we see that happening all the time, with the media, with, social media, with everything.
Yeah, for sure.
It's all about, picking a side and demonizing the other.
Yeah, and Professor Budil actually touches on this when he talks about Russia's economic resilience.
Okay.
Especially, in light of all the Western sanctions.
Right.
He actually argues that Russia's economy has, in a way, kind of like reoriented itself towards Asia, finding new markets and partnerships there.
So the sanctions might be kind of backfiring in a way.
Yeah, that's kind of what he's suggesting.
Interesting.
Yeah, and he makes this really fascinating comparison between Russia's experience in the 1990s and China's century of humiliation.
Oh, wow. That's a really interesting parallel.
Yeah. And, when you think about China's century of humiliation, which was, this period where basically the Western powers just like exploited China, for their own gain.
Right.
It makes sense that Russia would be kind of wary of, falling into a similar trap.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And so what Budil is saying is that, Russia, like China, is kind of drawing lessons from history and trying to assert itself as, a major player on the world stage.
Yeah, and I think that's something that a lot of people in the West, don't really understand or appreciate.
Okay.
They still see Russia as, this kind of like, defeated power from the Cold War.
Yeah.
But that's not the reality anymore.
And it's not how Russia sees itself.
Exactly.
Yeah. And, this actually leads Budil to a pretty thought-provoking conclusion.
Okay, what's that?
He argues that the U.S. should actually reconsider its adversarial stance towards China and instead, aim for a more balanced, multipolar world order.
So he's basically saying, let's move beyond this Cold War mentality.
Yeah, exactly. And he believes that that would ultimately be, more stable.
Right.
And prevent this kind of like, zero-sum competition that's driving so much global tension right now.
That's a pretty radical idea, but I could see where he's coming from.
Yeah, it definitely challenges, a lot of the conventional thinking.
For sure.
But it also kind of raises this really important question, right?
Yeah. What's that?
If these dominant narratives about the conflict, are incomplete or misleading, what alternative frameworks, could we use to better understand what's really going on?
That's a $1 million question, isn't it?
It is. Yeah. And that's something that we're going to continue exploring, as we delve deeper into these sources.
Sounds good. I'm looking forward to it.
Me too.
All right. Well, let's take a quick break and then we'll come back and dive into those alternative frameworks.
So, it's not just about geopolitics, though, is it? Like, what I find really interesting is how Professor Budil also kind of delves into the psychological dimensions of this whole conflict.
Yeah, like how trauma and societal anxieties shape how we perceive and respond to things.
Exactly. Yeah, like he's saying, our past experiences kind of create this filter through which we view the present. And, he specifically talks about how, the 1968 invasion really instilled this, deep-seated fear of Russian aggression in the Czech psyche.
It's understandable, though, right? I mean, like, if you've lived through something like that.
Oh, absolutely.
It's going to shape your worldview.
For sure.
And he doesn't shy away from criticizing the Czech Republic's response to the current conflict either.
Oh, really? Yeah, he points out the dangers of, kind of dehumanizing an entire nation based solely on the actions of its government.
Right, because you can't just paint everyone with the same brush.
Exactly, yeah.
And that kind of us versus them mentality is something that Angelgard touches on as well.
Oh, yeah.
He argues that, these historical narratives, particularly those centered around victimhood and external threats, they can be misused.
Almost like a weapon in a way.
Yeah, like a way to, kind of manipulate public opinion and justify certain policies.
Yeah, and he suggests that in Poland, this narrative of Russia as this existential threat might actually be stifling dissent and justifying policies that might not actually be in Poland's best interests.
Right. It's like, using fear to kind of shut down any kind of critical thinking or debate.
Exactly. Yeah. And it makes you wonder, who benefits from perpetuating these kinds of narratives?
That's a good question, yeah.
And both Budil and Angelgard also kind of highlight the economic factors that are at play here, too.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Like Budil, for example, argues that the West has really underestimated Russia's economic resilience, especially its pivot towards Asia.
Right. Like they've been able to kind of, find new markets and partners.
Yeah. And he even suggests that the sanctions might be backfiring.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Like pushing Russia closer to China and actually accelerating the shift towards a multipolar world.
It's like the old saying, the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Exactly, yeah.
And, while Budil focuses on Russia's economic reorientation, Angelgard is more concerned about the economic implications for Poland of its unwavering support for Ukraine.
Oh, right.
He worries that Poland might become overly reliant on the U.S. and NATO, both economically and militarily.
And that could potentially jeopardize their long-term autonomy.
Yeah, exactly, because, they'd be kind of beholden to those other powers.
Right. And he sees echoes of historical patterns here, where Poland's allegiances have kind of left it vulnerable in the past.
Makes sense.
Yeah. And so, looking at these sources together, I think they really challenge us to think critically about the information that we're consuming.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, they remind us that there are always multiple perspectives. There are always layers of complexity.
Yeah.
And there are always, hidden interests at play.
And it's about, looking beyond the headlines, questioning assumptions, and really considering, the long-term consequences of our actions.
Right. And, I think most importantly, resisting that urge to oversimplify and demonize.
Yeah.
To see the world in black and white, good versus evil.
It's because it's just not that simple.
It's not, yeah, and it doesn't reflect the reality of these, complex geopolitical situations.
Exactly.
So, as we continue to kind of grapple with this ongoing conflict in Ukraine, I think it's crucial to remember these insights from Professor Budil and Yan Angelgard.
For sure.
Be wary of those simplistic narratives. Be mindful of how historical trauma can kind of cloud our judgment.
Right.
And be critical of those who might be profiting from conflict.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah. Because often the people who are pushing for war are the ones who are going to benefit the most from it.
Absolutely. And, it's not always the people who are actually fighting the war who are making those decisions.
Right. Exactly.
So, we have to be careful about who we listen to and whose interests we're serving.
Yeah. And I think, one of the things that both of these sources really highlight is the importance of, kind of stepping back and looking at the bigger picture.
Right.
And, trying to understand the different perspectives that are involved. And not just, falling into that trap of, good guys versus bad guys.
Because the reality is always much more nuanced than that.
It is. Yeah. And, I think that's something that's really important to keep in mind, as we continue to kind of, navigate this really complex and challenging situation.
Yeah, for sure.
It's easy to get lost in all the noise, especially with a conflict like this.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I mean, we're constantly being bombarded with information, from all sides, and it's hard to know what to believe sometimes.
Yeah, and I think that's what makes these alternative perspectives so valuable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. They kind of force us to take a step back and question, what we think we know.
Yeah, and, both Budil and Angelgard, they both highlight the dangers of just blindly accepting the prevailing narratives.
Especially when those narratives are fueled by fear and, historical trauma.
Right. It's like, we're so quick to jump to conclusions and, demonize the other side.
Yeah, and I think that's something we really need to be careful of.
Totally.
It's easy to fall into that trap.
And so if we're trying to navigate this, sea of information, right? Like, what can we do? How can we become more discerning consumers of news and analysis?
Well, I think one of the most important things is to be willing to listen to a variety of voices,
Yeah.
even those that challenge our preconceived notions. It's easy to just gravitate towards sources that confirm our existing biases,
Right.
But that doesn't really help us, develop a more nuanced understanding of the situation.
It's like that saying, you are what you eat.
Exactly.
If we only consume information that reinforces what we already believe, then we're not really expanding our knowledge or challenging our assumptions.
Right. And, it's also important to be critical of the sources that we rely on.
Yeah.
Who's funding them? What are their biases? What are their agendas?
It's like, we have to be like investigative journalists almost.
Yeah, exactly. Like, we can't just take everything at face value.
Right. Because, let's be honest, everybody has an agenda.
Even if it's not always apparent.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, finally, it's just crucial to remember that, understanding complex issues takes time and effort.
It's not a quick fix.
It's not, yeah.
There are no easy answers.
Right. It requires patience, critical thinking, and a willingness to kind of grapple with ambiguity.
It's not always about, finding the right answer.
Right.
It's about, developing a more informed and nuanced perspective.
Exactly. And I think, that's something that Professor Budil and Yan Angelgard, through their work, really encourage us to do.
Right.
They challenge us to think for ourselves, to question the narratives that we're given and to kind of embrace the complexities of the world around us.
And I think that's a really valuable lesson, no matter what topic we're exploring.
For sure.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, we encourage you to continue seeking out diverse perspectives, challenging your own assumptions, and engaging in, thoughtful dialogue.
Yeah, because the more informed we are, the better equipped we are to, kind of navigate the complexities of our world.
Right.
And contribute to, a more peaceful and understanding future.
And with that, we'll leave you to ponder these ideas and continue your own exploration.
Thanks for joining us on this Deep Dive, everybody.